And now, as Monty Python used to say, for something completely different. I've been the chair for quite a long time now of a project involving Israelis, Palestinians, Jordanians, Americans, and Dutch dealing with water. And I'm going to tell you about its origins, and then I'm going to tell you what it does. And I hope you can drink from a fire hose, because this is going to go by pretty fast. The project we're in is called the Water Economics Project, or the WEP. And wait a minute. And it, as I say, has been in existence for quite a long time, and it's still very much in existence. How the various countries feel about it depends more on how they feel about what's happening in non-water issues than in the water issues. Okay, I'm going to start with this. At a conference I was at in approximately 1990, someone said, as people always do, well, the next war is going to be about water. They still go on saying things like that. And a professor from Tel Aviv, a friend of mine, named Gidon Fischelson, unfortunately now the late Gidon Fischelson, said, don't be silly. Water is a scarce resource. Scarce resources have value. And the value of the water in dispute is bounded above by the replacement cost given by desalination. And that upper bound is not very high. And I forget what comes next in these slides, but you never know. Yes. No. Okay. And I'm going to now bring Fischelson's example up to date. I don't remember his numbers, and they're out of date anyway. Oops. Okay. Here we go. This is a quasi-map of the water systems involved. It's not nearly complete. But what I want you to focus on is the following. The principal water issues involved in what I'm going to talk about are the Jordan River, which comes down from what I will call the Sea of Galilee, because the Arabs want to call it one thing and the Israelis want to call it another, and so they're all going to be annoyed with me, but equally. I want to take as an example what's called the mountain aquifer. You see in the middle this sort of great shaded blob. That's the mountain aquifer, and it is claimed by both Israel and Palestine. Mountain aquifer has about 650 million cubic meters a year in normal years, if there are any. Okay. Now, Fischelson would now observe that the cost of desalination on the Mediterranean coast is roughly 60 American cents per cubic meter. That's not exact. As you'll see in a minute, it's not intended to be exact, but it's roughly right. The water in the mountain aquifer, by the way, that says that with reasonable planning, water on the Mediterranean coast, or in the big cities on the Mediterranean coast, that would be Haifa, Tel Aviv, and Gaza, water is never going to be worth more than 60 cents a cubic meter. Okay. And that technology, by the way, keeps driving the price down. Okay. But water in the mountain aquifer isn't on the coast, and if you wanted to bring it to the coast, which would be the natural thing to do with it, this is just an example, by the way. What I'm going to say about this would apply to nearly any other example about where you want to put the water. That would cost roughly 40 cents a cubic meter to pump it up and get it to the cities of the coast. But that means that ownership of mountain aquifer water in situ is not worth more than 20 cents per cubic meter. 60 cents if you can get it to the coast, minus the 40 cents it will cost to get it there. Now, 100 million cubic meters of water, I use 100, by the way, not because it's particularly realistic, but because I'm really good at multiplying by 100, okay? And 100 million cubic meters is a pretty large slug of water in this dispute. It's a little bit less than the Palestinians are now permitted to take, but as you'll see in a minute, it wouldn't matter if I took 200 or 300 or some other number a little less easy to do in my head. Okay, that means that 100 million cubic meters of water, ownership of it, is not worth more than 20 million and that per year. Countries don't go to war over $20 million issues, or for that matter, twice that, 40 million or whatever. So one of the lessons here is that water ownership may not be worth very much, and water disputes may be over something that can possibly be turned into money terms, and I'm going to discuss that a bit later on. Now, in particular, this leads to the following. Every country with a seacoast can have as much water as it wants if it chooses to spend the money to do it. So that means as far as water is concerned, every country with a seacoast can be self-sufficient in food if it's willing to incur the costs of acquiring the necessary water. Disputes over water among such countries are merely disputes over costs, not over life and death. That's really important. That is not something that everybody recognizes. Okay? And to drive it home, I will simply observe that water is not worth war. That's the first conclusion of this project. Now, you may think that I've just said that, well, the real solution to all this thing is desalination. That's wrong. Okay? I know that's what I said, but it's not if you listen carefully, you heard me say that the cost of desalination was an upper bound, not that it was, in fact, the way to go. It's a way out of the problem, but it's not necessarily an efficient way out of the problem. Okay. Now, if you were to scratch an economist, which is not something I recommend, if you were to scratch an economist and say, well, how should water or some other natural resource or lots of other things be distributed, the answer you'll certainly get back is, well, the free market will take care of it. That's a really important statement. It is, in some sense, there are two kinds of economists, I should mention, microeconomists and macroeconomists. I'm a microeconomist. The other people don't know what they're doing. I try not to, I try to stay friends with them, but there we are. The most important thing that microeconomics has to say to other people is this statement I just made about how resources and the free market will in principle take care of everything. But the second most important thing they have to say is that's not always true. Okay? And I'm going to illustrate in a minute why it's not true, and it's really not true about water. I can't resist the joke, by the way. The notion that the free market will do anything, will fix everything, is gospel, or was gospel, at the University of Chicago. And someone once said, you know, those people have learned how to begin spelling banana, but they haven't learned how to stop. Anyway, okay. Now, the reason that actual markets will not work, free markets, water markets will not work, is the following. The proposition that free markets will do the whole job rests on certain assumptions. And sometimes they're good assumptions, but in this case, they're rather bad assumptions. In the first place, what has to be true is that there are a lot of little buyers and little sellers to make this happen. More important, what has to be true is that the benefits that come from the resource, in this case the benefits from water, have to be all private benefits. And by private, then they can be reduced to some things in the price system. That means you can't have what economists call, I've forgotten what now for the moment what the word is, but that means you can't have a situation in which there are effects that are not part of the price system. There are, first place, environmental effects that are not part of the price system, usually. You have to worry about what pollution is going to do, air pollution is going to do, and that's not, unless you regulate it, and then it won't be just a free market. This thing doesn't work. In water, there are some obvious cases. One is, of course, that water is important for environmental purposes, period. The second is a little subtler. A lot of countries in the world, and also in the Middle East, subsidize water for farmers. Okay. That statement, I'm not arguing now whether that's a good policy or a bad policy, but it is typically the government policy. And if that's the way they feel about water, that is an implicit statement that that water in the hands of farmers is worth more than the farmers will pay for it. That's what a subsidy is for. Okay? And that means that's an externality. That was the word I was thinking of before. That's not just a private. The value of water is not just a private value here. There's also a social value. And it may be a perfectly sensible social value. As I said, I'm not discussing that. I'm not sure I even have an opinion about it. Okay. So actual water markets, water markets, regardless of what the World Bank keeps saying, will not work. An outstanding example, by the way, is that I once heard somebody from Chile talk about the following. Said the World Bank said we should just use just free water markets, and we tried that, but we have flamingos, and the flamingos live in the wetlands, and there's nobody who speaks in the market for the flamingos. The wetlands are drying up, okay, and so on. All right, so what our project has done is to create, I'm trying to find the arrow here, is to create a method for dealing with these problems and to produce, in the first instance, it produces optimal sustainable management, and it also produces ways of resolving water conflicts. I'm going to talk first about them. I'm talking about that in that order. We have produced computer programs known as WAS and MyWAS. WAS stands for Water Allocation System, and that was a one-year model. MyWAS, which is the current model, stands for Multi-Year Water Allocation System. Some people think that it means that WAS belongs to me, but that's not what is intended. And that's something that's much more powerful and will deal with lots of changes over time, and so forth. Okay, now how does that work? Well, what both WAS and MyWAS do, I'm going to give the WAS example here because it's easier to put on the screen. What that does is to take the available water and assign it so that the benefits to be gotten from the water are the largest. It optimizes those benefits. Okay? And it does so subject to certain constraints. I will come to the constraints. How do we get those benefits, measure those benefits? I would love to tell you the story that leads to this diagram, but I'm not going to because I'm not going to have time. And it's really funny. You can ask me afterwards. But you'll have to take my words for it, that here is the demand curve for water and without the supply. And you can measure the net benefits to be obtained from the water, the gross benefits to be obtained from the water by looking at the area under the demand curve. You'll have to take my word for that. Of course, we don't just want gross benefits. We're interested in net benefits. And that makes you have to worry about the costs. And in this version, there are several water sources, and there's a low-cost one with a limited amount, and then a higher one. That's what the steps are for, but that doesn't matter really for what I'm going to say. And the appropriate measure is the difference between the costs and the gross benefits. And that's what gets maximized. However, only subject to certain constraints. What happens is we take information. Well, first place, each country, in this case, 3 of them. By the way, this would work for any country in the world, but we practice on the hard ones. In each of the countries, you divide the country into districts. You want the district to be as small as possible, but not smaller. And that typically means it's states or communities or governorates or whatever. That's because that's how the data are collected. And within each of these units, we have information on what are the freshwater sources. By the way, this also operates with treated wastewater, but I don't have the time to go into that. We know what the fresh water sources are, how much they give each, or in a normal year, and so on. We also know demand curves for each country, water demand curves. In our system, there's a water demand curve for industry, for agriculture, and for urban use. And we have to make certain assumptions about that, which I don't have time to go into. But there's something else, which is you have to allow for the externalities. You have to allow for the values of water that are not represented in a private system. And the user of this model gets to specify what those are. How much the farmers should be subsidized, how much water needs to be set aside for environmental purposes. And by the way, the model will also tell you, and what difference does it make if you change the numbers. Okay. What WAS and MyWAS will do for you is quite a lot, especially MyWAS. I'm now mostly talking about MyWAS. If you have a menu of possible infrastructures that you're thinking of building, the first thing that'll happen is that if you put this, if you start putting in the information into MyWAS, what you will get back is a menu of which of these should you be building, when should you build them, how large should you build them. Okay. Next, you can find about out about storage management and aquifer management. You have a reservoir or you have an aquifer, and you need to control how much there is in it or take from it. And in particular, going after the Joseph legend, it's possible that you may want to put more water into the aquifer, back into the aquifer in wet years, and take out more of it in dry years. And with appropriate safeguards around the numbers, MyWAS will tell you how to do that. It will also tell you how to treat fossil aquifers, and also how to deal with global warming and climatic uncertainty, in the sense that you can run this thing for a lot of assumptions about those things, and you can decide, okay, now what are the things that stand out that they're good no matter what happens, or in the most probable cases. All right. Moving on. Okay. We're now coming to the really good part. Okay. That means this is the part that economists really like. I need to talk about something called shadow values and something else called scarcity rents. Okay. Now, shadow value, sometimes called shadow prices, but in this thing we do not distinguish it from, we want to distinguish it from actual prices. Many of you may know the following proposition. Okay, this is MIT. It's this is I'm about to say a technical proposition. If you are maximizing something subject to constraints, there will appear, you can make appear with the answer, a set of numbers. Lagrange multipliers is one version, shadow values is another, in which each of the numbers is associated with a constraint. And what the constraint measures is by how much would the thing you're maximizing increase if you relaxed the constraint a little bit. Okay. And they play a central role in what's about to happen. Here is an example of a lake and a water system, a water conveyance system that takes the water out of the lake and brings it to 3 cities, A, B, and C. I didn't give you the chance to look at this, really, so I will simply say that anybody from the Middle East would know perfectly well what water system I have in mind, but it doesn't matter. Okay, and the first question is there a shadow? What is the shadow value of water in the lake? You might think it would be 0. And for my purposes, by the way, I'm going to assume that water just comes out of the lake at no cost at all and goes down the pipe. Okay, that's just to make this simpler, not because it's likely to be true. And you have to think about, is the shadow value of the water in the lake going to be 0 because the water just comes out of it? And the answer is no. That's because there is an opportunity cost to sending the water someplace. And in particular, you can think about the following. Suppose that you price the water at the lake at 0. Okay. Most interesting lakes would have the property that more people would want more of the water than is available from the lake. And therefore, there's a scarcity price on water. And the scarcity price is the shadow value of water at the origin of this. Now, look at the diagram for a minute and forget about B and C. I assert that in the optimal answer, supposing the pipes are large enough, in the optimal way of thinking about this is that you ought to be transporting water from the lake to A, if and only if the resulting shadow value at A is equal to the shadow value at the lake plus the transit cost per cubic meter. Okay. And it's easy enough to see from this diagram why that has to be true, and I'm going to run out of time. Yeah, but I got the important part to come. Take my word. Slow for that. All right. Take my word for it. There's also a way of dealing with this. Should you be building if you don't have a pipeline there now, should you have a pipeline there now? Now, I'm going to produce some examples. Now, you should understand that I'm taking these numbers from works that were done, roughly a little less than 10 years ago. And you should take these not as what the right numbers are now, but as illustrations of what you can do with this stuff. Okay. Well, that's basically what that says. Okay, the first has to do with Israel. These were forecasts made in the late 1990s about 2010. 2010 happens to be over, but what the hell? Okay, and here what we have are the various districts in Israel, and there are 2 sets of numbers. The upper set is the shadow value in the district for a normal year. Okay? The lower value is the shadow value in the district for a drought which affects, lowers the natural water supply in that year by 30%. Okay. And I'm going to, all right, I'll risk it. Okay. If you, can you read the numbers?
Yeah.
Because if you can't, there's no point in my asking you what you see. Okay. Look at that thing and ask the question, what is there that ought to jump out at you about the lower, yes?
Many cases like 3 times higher.
Yes, that's true. But what else should jump out at you? I'll give you a hint.
One of the numbers is very low, 0.09.
Yes, I know. But you're looking at the wrong part of the map. Yes.
Along the coast,
yes.
The shadow price is 60 cents per cubic meter.
Very good. And what's happening here is the following. In a normal year, the coastal cities have a shadow value of water that is what more water would be worth to them that is less than 60 cents. Okay? And that says that in the normal year, you don't want to have a desalination plant in these places. The desalination places come online when there's lots of, when there's a normal amount of water. Now, Israel has now fairly recently produced a number of very large desalination plants on the coast. That's after some years of drought. And you might say, well, why don't you just build the desalination plant and then you can turn it off or on after it's built, depending on whether there's a drought? And the problem is it's not that simple. Most of the costs in that 60 cents, a great part of it, has to do with the capital costs of building the plants in the first place. And once you have built them, you would use them all the time. But whether that's a good thing to do or a bad thing to do is a rather complicated decision. Okay? This can help, but it can't really determine it. Next example. Palestine. Here, this is also for 2010 apparently. We have examples of what would happen with full infrastructure up, with and without they're being allowed double the quantity that they now take from the mountain aquifer. Obviously, the higher numbers are what happens if they get double that. The lower numbers, they don't. And you will see that there is, a fairly substantial difference. You should also, however, look at Gaza. Gaza is at the lower left on the coast. And you will see that, oops, there's the desalination number again. And that's the desalination number without the doubling. Okay. And of course, you will say, probably, that's because the population of Gaza is getting larger. Right? It's not right. In fact, in these things, what's happening is that Gaza doesn't, in fact, need a desalination plant in this particular illustration for itself. What it needs is a desalination plant to push water uphill to the lower West Bank, because in the scenario in which you get the desalination plant, the Palestinians are not allowed to take very much from the mountain aquifer. Okay. I'm going to come back to that. That raises something important, which will occur later. Finally, Jordan. This is Jordan in the upper values without, with expanded infrastructure in 2020 from what it was in the late 90s, and without. And you will see that it makes a pretty big difference. Which one? Focus, for instance, on Amman. Without further further infrastructure than there was originally, you've got a shadow value of $33 per cubic meter. Okay. I'm not suggesting that people will buy that. I'm suggesting this is a catastrophe, and you have to plan something to keep it from happening, and they've done that. But I'm also interested in the following fact. In the Jordan Valley, which is on the left, you will note that the numbers in the Jordan Valley are pretty low. Right? In Maraba, for instance, it's only 13 cents a cubic meter either way. And in Balka, which is where the water comes out of the Jordan Valley, in a way I'll describe in a minute, it's still very low. Okay, now we come to questions. Now you got to wake up. No, you don't get to ask. I get to ask. Yes.
I just have a quick question.
Yes.
The large numbers for infrastructure, is that related to not desalination, but digging deep into the aquifer or something, or what's that?
No. Neither.
The smaller numbers. Sorry.
I know.
What is the infrastructure, I guess?
Oh, the infrastructure is conveyance lines, treatment plants. The only place where Jordan could possibly have its own desalination things without cooperation would be in Aqaba, down at the bottom. Okay. So now the question is, why is it that at Balka, the water price is very low, but in Amman, it's very high? What's missing?
Elevation and lack of water.
No, it's not lack of water. It's not even elevation.
It's a regulation policy.
Nope. 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 Try again. What would you want to do if you saw those two big differences? Right. And what do you have to move water from the...
It's a place to take it from.
Yes, I'll tell you right now, it's going to come from the Jordan River. Okay. Now the question is, why don't they do it? What else do you need to get the water there? Pipes and pumps, right. And with the existing infrastructure, as it was, there was a pipeline from up to Amman, but the pipeline only would carry 45 million cubic meters a year, and it's always full. And that means that you can't solve the Amman issue because you don't have enough space to move the water up. Now they've built all sorts of other things since then. Okay. By the way, first time I ever talked about this in Jordan, my now friend Muntar Haddadin was a serious big player was a serious big player in Jordan water issues, said, what if 3 of us were lost in the desert east of here? What then would be the value of a bottle of water? And the right answer to that is, well, the value of the bottle of water to the travelers would be very great, but the value of water in the river would not be changed, because the problem isn't whether there's enough water, the problem is whether it's in the right places. And what's missing is the ability to transport it. And you want to think about conveyance lines in this. Okay, I'm now going to move on to the important part. This has to do with conflict resolution. Conflict resolution can be gotten in several ways, and I'm going to describe what it is we want to do. Suppose that you have 2 countries, A and B, and it doesn't matter which is which for this purpose. And there's a district in A that is close to a district in B, just to make it easy. And in the district in A, the shadow value of water is considerably greater than the district in B. Okay. It would then they would both gain if the district in B were to sell water to the district in A. Okay. And that's where what comes on. trades, if our version is you make trades in water at the shadow value given for that trade when you run the two models together, the A model and the B model together. And here are some examples. Okay, first place, here are some assumptions. In what follows, as it says, there's no political statement intended. Okay, I'm beginning to talk about ownership now. And what I'm after is going to be a result that says that ownership, if you do it right, ownership doesn't matter very much. So I've examined 3 cases for the Jordan River. One is one in which Israel has 92%, Jordan has 8%, and Palestine has nothing. This is approximately the existing situation. The second one, Israel has 66%, Jordan 17%, Palestine 17%, rounding off. And the last one is when they have equal shares. Okay. For the mountain aquifer, which is the other big one, there is a case in which it's only claimed by Israel and Palestine. And it begins with 80% for the Israelis and 20% for the Palestinians, which is close to what the current situation is. And then we shift in 20% lumps until we get the extreme at the other end. Right. Now, if you do that, this graph shows the gains from doing this. And I have to explain how to read it. Each column, in this red are the Palestinians, blue are the Israelis. And each column reflects, under the situation described by the column, I'll explain which is which in a minute, how much better off you would be. You would be if you had if you did the selling rather than trying to use the water yourself. Okay. And at the left, we have the ownership of the Jordan River is A, B, and C along the bottom of each one. Each panel is for a different assumption about the mountain aquifer. Yeah, I'm trying, but I tell you, I was run out of the first 10 minutes of my time. And you can see that at the left, Palestine gains a lot, Israel gains a little, and that's also true at the right. But don't think that that is because Palestine gets a little water. Palestine is buying the water, is selling the water, buying the water. Okay. At the left, that's true. They are buying the water, and they need it very badly. But at the right, they have a lot of water, and they're gaining from selling from Israel to Israel. And both parties gain, and it's a theorem that they can't both. Nobody loses in this sort of thing, and there are big gains, bigger, let me say, than a big shift of ownership would be without cooperation. All right, and that generates the version. I'm going to skip over this. I've done it for trilateral cooperation, but you're going to get to the same. We're going to get to the same kind of result. It remains the fact that, in fact, the value of ownership of the water in situ is very low. Okay. Now, there are objections. There are always objections, particularly in the Middle East. Everybody knows how to object. There's a question as to whether they know how not to object, but that's another matter. Okay. The foolish objections. You're forcing us to sell our water. Well, believe it or not, all 3 countries used to say that to me. And that's a little odd because we're talking about a closed system of 3 countries and they can't all be forced to do it. And anyway, nobody in this is forcing them to sell the water. You sell the water only if it's to your advantage to sell parts of the water. That also goes with the objection, which is, I get a little bit more often. The rich country will buy all the water. In this case, that means the Israelis are going to buy all the water. Well, in the first place, why? Let's take the Israelis and the Palestinians. In this system, they only get to buy from the Palestinians if it benefits the Palestinians. And I'm not talking about individual Palestinians, I'm talking about the government. Okay. Also, it might be the case that Israel has a lot of money and could buy a lot of the water, but why would it want to buy all the water? Water gets used for different things. They're not buying, the first drops of water are important for human life. By the time you're washing your car 7 times a week, it doesn't seem so valuable. Now, however, there are actual, I'm getting toward the end, there are actual objections. The principal one is, what happens if one of the parties pulls out? You have an agreement to go into this system, and then one of them pulls out. What happens then? Well, what might be the case is that you'll find that the other party has not built infrastructure which they would need without the cooperation. In this case, the danger would be mostly on for the Palestinians. Okay. Now, the first answer, but as you'll see in a minute, not a very good one. The first answer is, well, why would the other party want to withdraw? Because everybody's benefiting. It's not to their self-interest to withdraw. Well, yeah, but maybe it's not so simple. Now, I am now going to tell you a small story, which if you were from the Middle East, you would know right away. But most of you are presumably not from the Middle East, so I'm not going to ask if you all know the story, and I'm going to go ahead and tell it. A duck is swimming in the Suez Canal. It is called to one of the banks by a scorpion. Yes, Mr. Scorpion, says the duck. The scorpion says, Mr. Duck, I really need to get across the canal, and I can't swim. Could you please put me on your back and take me across? And the duck says, Mr. Scorpion, you must think I'm a real fool. You're a scorpion. And when you get halfway across the canal, you'll sting me and I'll die. Oh, Mr. Duck, says the scorpion, I would never do that because it would be against my self-interest. Because if you were to die, eventually you would sink, and I would die also because I can't swim, which is why I need you in the first place. And the duck thinks about this and says, you got a point, hop on. And they get halfway across the canal, and the scorpion stings the duck. And with his dying breath, the duck says, why? And the scorpion said, what did you expect? This is the Middle East. Okay. So there's something in the self-interest part, but perhaps not enough in this part of the world. Okay. Then there is the question of, as I say, of hostages to fortune. But in this case, it would be the Palestinians. And what would happen would be if the Israelis withdrew, the Palestinians would need a desalination plant in Gaza, which they don't necessarily otherwise have. They would also need a pipeline to Hebron. And in the time, it would take about 2 years to build those things. But in the meantime, the Palestinians could, in principle, take care of it by simply having more water pumped than the treaty allows from the mountain aquifer until this comes on. Okay. Now, I should say this project is definitely not over. It may never be over. It keeps coming back. I'm working in an area in which death is not necessarily forever, and there's a lot of reconstruction. Okay, but I want to stop by telling you the story of Abraham and Abimelech, and this comes from the book of Genesis, section 21. Abimelech was the king of the Philistines, and he came to talk with Abraham, he also brought the captain of his army. And Abimelech said to Abraham, I can't do this in the flowery words of the Bible, but I can sketch it. He says, we see that you are on good terms with God. Please, we'd like to swear that each of us will do fairly, will deal fairly with the other. And Abraham says, all right. And they swear. And then Abraham reproaches Abimelech for a well that Abimelech's servants, that Abraham dug and that Abimelech's servants stole. And Abimelech said, I didn't know anything about this until you just said this. And Abraham then separates from his flock 7 ewe goats. And what's the meaning of this, says Abimelech. And Abraham says, you are to take these goats as a token that I really dug the well. In fact, one of the propositions that comes out of this is that this was at a place got named the place of the well, or Beersheba, which is, of course, a town in southern Israel. But if you think about it, that is the earliest I've ever found of trying to cooperate on water with an exchange of something else. And of course, Abraham and Abimelech didn't have computers, and they wouldn't have known about shadow values, okay? And so on and so forth. But in our project, we like to think that they would approve of what we're doing.